or the leader of a very powerful union make the kind of statement you just made of solidarity with civil society. Thank you so, so much. Our next speaker is Ben Powless, a wonderful young leader and a very powerful up-and-coming voice in our country. Ben is a Mohawk citizen from Six Nations in Ontario, currently living in Ottawa. He has a degree in human rights, Indigenous and environmental studies from Carleton University in Ottawa. He has worked with the Indigenous Environmental Network and focused on climate justice and resource extraction in Indigenous territories, particularly in the tar sands, and most recently Ecology Ottawa as an organizer against the Energy East pipeline. Ben is an incredible ally on that struggle, and we're just about to launch a second round of the Energy East tour, this one through Atlantic Canada. Ben is also an organizer with the Defenders of the Land Network, Idle No More, and was a co-founder of the Canadian Youth Climate Coalition. I'm delighted to honor and welcome Ben Powless.
Beautiful. Okay. Sego. I just want to say nyawa, thank you to the organizers, to everybody for having me here, to all of our co-presenters as well, for sharing this opportunity tonight with all of us. It's a particular honor to speak after the chief of my community, Chief Ava Hill as well. So I'm going to show a few slides tonight. I got here just about 10 minutes before it started. It was a very long day of travel. The slides are not in, I think, a great particular order, but they do speak to a lot of what I'll be speaking about. So I'll start with that. I want to start off talking a little bit about a prophecy I was reading about recently. This was told by another Haudenosaunee leader, a guy named John Mohawk, who passed away not too long ago. And he talks about how he was traveling at one point with a Hopi faith keeper. He brought him on tour to a bunch of universities across the United States and took him around the Niagara area and showed him, some of the hydro developments and everything like that. And this Hopi faith keeper, asked to pull over and take it all in for a second. And so he did, and he came back and he explained to John that, the Hopis had this prophecy that they had to pass down, this prophecy of the Spider Woman, that eventually the Spider Woman would begin to crisscross Turtle Island, North America, with her webs, and eventually would begin to envelop all of the land with her web. And this was basically for them a signal of the end times of civilization, of mankind as we know it. I think that looking around our society today, we could make a similar case with a lot of the development projects that we're being asked to consider, particularly the pipelines that cover northern Alberta, that bring oil, meant to bring oil out of the ground, but also a new and very different expansion of other different extreme forms of energy. In many ways, Western civilization is still a recent creation, still very immature in many ways, still hasn't figured out how to not destroy everything it comes into contact with. But even then, I think that Western civilization is interesting because it's begun to create a lot of its own prophecies about what will happen if we don't live within our limits, if we don't have respect and reverence for all creation, for each other. And the prophecies of Western science are no less dire. Unabated contamination of our atmosphere will eventually heat our planet, derail long-standing weather patterns under which our species have come into existence, will lead to catastrophic events that we now ridicule our ancestors for taking as warnings that the gods were angry, hurricanes and droughts, when our ancestors are perhaps more sentient than we'd want to admit. These are the things that could also lead to most of the species of this planet not existing by the end of our current century. I think we should take a little bit of solace from the words of another Haudenosaunee faith keeper, Oren Lyons, who reminds us that we don't need to save the earth. The earth will continue to exist with or without us, but that we have no idea how we would survive without most of the planets and animals existing on this planet. And even if, just the simple species of bees go, that they may be enough to wipe out most of our civilization. So both Indigenous and Western prophecies tell us that we have to change a lot of the things that we're doing, or we may suffer this incredible risk. That work has already begun in a big way in Canada and the US with the resistance to the development of the tar sands, the largest single source of greenhouse gas emissions in Canada, on track to equal the emissions of about 140 countries, or about 1 billion people within the next decade, if they're allowed to expand. And that resistance in a lot of ways is being led by a lot of First Nations group in Northern Alberta, but in other cases, a lot of other struggles over extreme energy, including fracking, mining, logging, and the expansion of energy infrastructure, such as pipelines. There are a lot of challenges to that work, though, and one of the ones that I want to touch off is something that Ava sort of started to really get into, the state of colonialism that still exists today in Canada, and the state of racist and racist beliefs behind it. That quite simply, that we cannot explain how we got to where we are in Canada without understanding that Indigenous lives and communities are not valued equally. How else would we explain why Indigenous communities are allowed to become sacrifice zones for industry? Why else could we not explain that there isn't public outrage that people are getting sick and dying as a punishment for simply living in the same area as their ancestors and drinking the water and wild meats that their ancestors did? Or even more starkly, why isn't Canadian society outraged, completely outraged at the despicable numbers of missing and murdered Indigenous women? You can be guaranteed that if 1,000 wealthy women from downtown Toronto went missing over the last few decades, the Prime Minister would bring in the military. But in this case, the Canadian government has refused all intonations to support a public inquiry, suggesting that all the women missing and murdered are just individual crime, unrelated, urging us not to commit sociology and understand them as part of a wider body of beliefs and actions towards Indigenous women, in particular, Indigenous women in particular, and Indigenous communities more generally, because that would lead to a lot of uncomfortable conclusions. But when you really start to understand this in the historical context, you see that Indigenous communities, and particularly Indigenous women's bodies, have always been the subject of state control, from residential schools to forced sterilization programs that have happened, to the forced relocation of Indigenous communities into marginal lands, to the police forces of the land ignoring many of the cases of these women because they were seen as unworthy, unloved, unneeded, not worth our time or consideration. But we have bad news for Stephen Harper, because this is an idea whose time has come and which won't go away. This is an idea that we won't let rest. This is an idea, quite frankly, that we aren't going to, back away from. We also know more broadly that when a lot of these communities actually decide to speak up, when they decide to stand up to the government, they're slapped down. We only have to look 1 year in the past at the community called Sipuktuk in New Brunswick, a community that was resisting one of the most extreme and risky forms of energy development on their land, hydraulic fracturing or fracking, that has been banned in many jurisdictions around the world after evidence showed that it lead to minor disruptions like aquifer contamination and earthquakes. We saw this community with very legitimate concerns about this kind of development, given no real place to voice them, and the community decided that they couldn't accept this level of risk to their drinking water, to future generations. And so they decided to occupy their own land to prevent the company from coming in. And they were treated like an occupying army. They were met by snipers, armed forces, tanks on behalf of the government. Many people were arrested and are still facing trial, in scenes that remind us how little has changed since the Oka crisis.
Shame.
It also reminds us that across this country, we, the collective people who live here, don't really understand each other. Because for one segment of the Canadian population, this was understood as an unruly group of rowdy Indians trying either to stop progress, demand money, or play around in army fatigues, who violated the supreme laws of the land and had to be brought to justice by any means necessary. And this was a common media framing, right? The other understanding possible, and one that I share, is that that there was a history of this land, in such a way that the history of that land is such that no government, no company can actually claim a legal right to the land. Understanding that this community has had a long history of oppression and top-down impositions. Understanding that community members were doing the only thing that they could possibly think of to try and stop this imminent threat. there was a lot of talk about reconciliation that goes on. And I think it's a very good thing that, we're starting to discuss the idea of reconciliation. But I think a lot of us are also understandably skeptical whenever the government or the courts say, hey, here's an idea that's going to solve all of our problems, because that's not generally gone very well for our communities. Because if this idea of reconciliation doesn't allow for us not to just collectively move people from that first understanding to the second, we won't prevent any similar incidents from happening in the future. Because reconciliation is really just another way of saying healing. But to paraphrase the healing walks that happened in northern Alberta, you can't start healing unless you've stopped harming. You can't stop healing until you've stopped the destruction. And healing can't be driven by the party responsible for inflicting the pain, as the government's hollow attempts at the residential school apology have laid bare. Many of our cultures have been wounded. Many of our languages are languishing. Many of our spirits have been broken. But still, our cultures have taught us resilience. Many of our people's ceremonies are all about enduring physical pain and discomfort, about finding relief in our beliefs of spirituality and in ourselves, about fundamental resilience. Our traditions teach us reverence for the land and for our mother, including our most sacred mother, Mother Earth. We have to do all that we can to protect, preserve, and empower those cultures and communities who are willing to stand up to protect Mother Earth and this new phase of hyper-destructive resource extraction as we bring online new technologies to scrape the bottom of the proverbial resource barrel. Speaking about the resistance, a lot of this work has started, as I mentioned, and the movements are beginning to collectively move together. And we've even begun to incorporate a lot of the Indigenous rights framework and environmental justice language into a lot of this work, which I think has been crucial to some of the successes achieved so far. About 5 years ago, organizers across North America made a concerted decision that in the lack of any government leadership around climate regulation, around tar sands development, around basically any environmentally sane trajectory, we would have to be a bit smarter to keep the tar sands in check, to keep our climate livable. And this was born, in this sort of framework was born the idea that we had to plug the pipelines to stop the critical expansion of oil infrastructure out of Alberta to make sure that the tar sands could not expand as their governments intended. And this set the stage for two fights that we're still fighting. TransCanada's Keystone XL pipeline, which you're seeing a number of photos from the fight in the US, and the Northern Gateway pipeline in British Columbia. Now, 6 years ago, if you had asked most of us if you thought that people power could stop a piece of energy infrastructure that was almost as unchallenged as a hydro pole, I think a lot of us would have been skeptical. But here we are, after 5 years of incredible campaigning, incredible work in both places, incredible leadership by communities in both places that have built alliances between Indigenous and non-Indigenous groups that have organized, in the US alone, thousands of people getting arrested in front of the White House as part of staged sit-ins and direct action there. Where we've seen there has actually been over 2 million people make submissions to the US government in opposition to the Keystone XL pipeline. I think the most contentious issue that people have ever sort of raised. And what's that done is it's actually created 5 years of indefinite delays of the Keystone XL pipeline. And there's a lot of reports that this could be squashed before the end of Obama's term by Obama himself, who has recently said that he will be considering the overall climate implications of the pipeline, which would be enough to stop not just this pipeline, but an additional 5.1 billion tons of greenhouse gas projects that were slated for the US. So in British Columbia, we see an entire province that has come together to reject this other pipeline, the Northern Gateway pipeline. Over 100 First Nations have banded together to sign on to declarations declaring the pipeline illegal in their territory. Others have set up permanent encampment blockades on their traditional territories before construction has even begun. We've seen it become such a political hot potato that every other party has rejected the pipeline, and even the normal pipeline cheerleaders in the Conservative Party, who eventually approved the pipeline, did so by quietly issuing a press release on a Friday afternoon in a quiet nod that they didn't even want to be attached to this decision. With the US and BC opposed to tar sands pipelines, oil companies, I think, wondered how they could unite the rest of the country. And lo and behold, TransCanada decided to put in an application for a 4,500 kilometer pipeline from the tar sands in Alberta all the way snaking through most of the major cities in the country, all the way to supertanker ports in Kakuna, home of endangered beluga spawning grounds, and St. John, New Brunswick, home of the highest tidal waters in the world. I think I'll have to actually, thank TransCanada for their assistance and for fomenting national resistance. And what's actually interesting is that these strategies are starting to work. So this year alone, there were, I don't think a lot of us have actually heard about this unless you read, the back of the business section. But this year, 3 actual tar sands drilling operations were actually abandoned in Alberta because of what the industry euphemistically refers to as transportation constraints and infrastructure challenges. That's all of us, by the way. And in stopping just those 3 projects, we've stopped 2.7 billion tons of greenhouse gases from going into the atmosphere and cost the industry $12 billion, which, if you open up the program, there's a blurb in there from Council of Canadians about how they decided not to offset, not to put money into offsets, but to invest in local infrastructure. I think it's a damn good return on investment to donate to these groups that are fighting over the oil industry. Now, these are very powerful companies, right? A lot of their power comes from their incredible amounts of money, billions and billions of dollars in store. And that money isn't just evaporating from our work directly combating them and stopping them, but it's also under direct assault from divestment groups here in the United States and Canada. In the US, there's already a very substantial divestment movement on the ground, and it's gaining steady momentum here in Canada as well, to the point where recently the World Council of Churches, as well as the Rockefeller Foundation, which is money from the heirs of Standard Oil's fortunes, have both agreed to start divesting from tar sands and put money into renewable energy and green jobs. We're even seeing socialist institutions like the World Bank and the International Energy Agency begin to understand the stakes and put out reports that suggest that as we see climate changing, governments will begin to legislate internationally, nationally, even locally against greenhouse gas emissions, and that investments in fossil fuels will begin to lose their values. The International Energy Agency alone suggests that 60% of fossil fuel reserves that exist may be unburnable, may never ever leave the ground. And they suggest even higher numbers for tar sands, which are much more carbon intensive, somewhere in the order of 75%, meaning most of the perceived value of oil companies may evaporate overnight as investors reevaluate their stocks, and which can rapidly change the stakes and power of these institutions as more and more analysts and forecasters begin to take their money out of these, failing institutions.
Yeah.
The other sort of piece there is that there's a lot of ongoing litigation that has the potential to change things fairly dramatically across the country. One of the most interesting court challenges recently has been led by the Beaver Lake Cree Nation, who are suing oil companies and the government alike for human rights violations stemming from the ongoing decimation of their traditional territories. This court challenge, the government tried to get thrown out over the past few years. It's why there hasn't been very little progress. But within the past year, the actual court decided that, no, this was a legitimate concern, that if this challenge is successful, could establish a precedent for communities being able to stop any of these projects on the grounds of seeing them as human rights violations and getting compensation for that. Immediately after the federal government gave the green light to Northern Gateway, they were served by 8 injunctions launched by a number of different environmental and First Nations groups who argued that they weren't properly consulted or accommodated by the government, where even a former federal minister noted that any one of these lawsuits could push the project back at least a number of years, perhaps indefinitely, and ultimately could kill it. But I think one of the most interesting things that has happened in Canadian law recently was the Chilcotin decision, which flipped the entire script on the balance of power in these resource decisions and gave that back to Aboriginal communities by cementing Aboriginal title as the underlying reality of our country. Now, there were still some problems, of course, with the court's decisions, there always are. the court still said the government could push a project through if it was absolutely necessary to safeguard the lives of every Canadian on the planet. But otherwise established that there would be a new benchmark for gaining consent from Indigenous communities, far and above the current minimum of consultation and accommodation. It was very telling that this was a unanimous decision, showing that Aboriginal title is here to stay and recognized in courts, superseding government and corporate claims to our people's lands. And personally, I'd like to imagine that, the day that Stephen Harper was told this, the results of the decision, there was a single tear that came down. The fourth piece of this puzzle is that there's been a lot of work to build up incredible amounts of mass opposition, bringing together diverse movements, nowhere better represented than at the recent People's Social Forum in Ottawa, which brought together 5,000 activists, unionists, Indigenous groups, and others from across the country in the largest gathering in this country's history. Or just last week at the People's Climate March in New York City, which saw over 400,000 people participate in the largest environmental rally, I think, in the planet's history. I think the government, yeah, simple. Some of you have organized protests, I'm sure, before, and sometimes it's good to get 100, 200 people out. 400,000 is a big march, is a big rally to organize. I think our government is seriously scared of a lot of these developments, that these diverse groups are beginning to unite, to come together in larger and larger numbers, particularly First Nations starting to stand up. They were scared enough of Chief Theresa Spence fasting across from Parliament Hill to go and try and discredit her by announcing, oh my God, she drives an SUV, which to anybody who's ever been in Northern Ontario communities that have ice roads and are not paved, it's not a big surprise. They were scared enough of Cindy Blackstock, who spends her time campaigning to get equal education funding for First Nations, to send government agents across the country to attend her talks and spy on her and report back. They were so scared of a group of Native youth that called themselves I Don't Know More, who decided that they were going to take up arms, figuratively, against the omnibus bills that they had tried to pass that would take away the rights of all Canadians to have their say in democratic processes. That they started monitoring all of their round dances in malls and intersections. Not so much, I think, because they thought that a round dance in the Eaton Centre would lead to, riots on the streets everywhere. But I think because it showed that, not just Native youth were starting to pay attention, but also that non-Natives in the media were paying attention as well to what was going on in Native communities, and were even generating a lot of support. And even on another personal side note, Dylan here from the Council of Canadians recently shared with me one of those actual declassified documents that the government had written up about all of the monitoring that they were doing of all these sort of protests and blockades and events. 30 pages in total, a few hundred listings of mostly Bano sort of things like First Nations blockade, Six Nations, or Environmental Rally Vancouver, with two exceptions. One of Theresa Spence and the other entry for Ben Powless Mohawk Environmental Rally in Toronto in 2011, which was a little bit creepy to see, a little bit of an honor to see that the government also put my name there, but also just bad intelligence. I wasn't even at this supposed rally. That was in my name. So whoever here is from CSIS or RCMP should take note of that. And I've asked my friends in Toronto if they ever do organize a Ben Powless rally, I'd be happy to come down and see. But it's really telling. The government is so scared of this united and unifying opposition that's being built up that they're sending the RCMP, they're sending CSIS, they're sending the government's own, Prime Minister's own office appointees to monitor these protests, to take a look and make sure that they have their fingers on everything that's going on across this country. And that's why we need to do exactly more of that.
Yeah. Brother.